all around the state and share the history of these places and talk about things that are no longer around. And it's always interesting because invariably I get somebody that comes up to me afterwards and they say, why do you do this? And there's a lot of answers to that. I find it interesting. Obviously, you find it interesting. You're here on a Tuesday night, and you could probably be doing lots of other things, listening to me talk. And what it really boils down to is our community. And we're going to talk a lot about communities tonight. We're going to talk a lot about the Colfax community and people that live in this community, because Colfax had a variety of people that lived here. And there was really two separate groups of people, and there were lots of subsets within that. And so, as we talk about the community itself, I want you to keep that in mind and think about your current community, whether you live here in Colfax or whether you live in Jasper County or the state of Iowa. What exactly does community mean to you? Because at the end of the day, it's not about the history, it's about bringing people together. So when I come into a group like this and I see this crowd, this is just fantastic. I've done almost 100 programs. This is number 90 since I first started doing these in 2015. And this is one of the biggest crowds that I've had. I don't think it's the biggest, but it's very close to it. So thank you very much for coming out this evening. Now, when I do these programs, there's a variety of ways to present information to people. And one of the things that I found really engage people is when you take on a persona of somebody who lived the experience and lived the time. And so, as I talk to you tonight, I'm not going to be talking to you as Dave Baker, but instead I'm going to be talking to you as Charles Freeman. And Charles Freeman was one of the coal miners here in Colfax. Now, he was not originally from Colfax. He was actually born in a little community to the south of here, a little way south of here, southeast of here, called Beacon. Does anybody know where Beacon is? Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Now, I bring that up just because we're going to talk about my journey, Mr. Freeman's journey, as a coal miner, and some of the different places he went to, and that's going to influence how he perceives things here at Colfax. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Coal mining is a grueling task, and a dirty one. When we met miners returning from their work, they scarcely looked as if they belonged to the white race. Even their ears were filled with coal dust. Their eyes gleamed white with their smudgy features. Their clothes were grimy. Their caps surmounted by greasy, carbon-covered oil lamps that looked like small pitchers with wicks protruding from their spouts. Grace Tripp, Colfax president, from 1890 to 1910. Between 1880 and 1920, coal mining exploded across Iowa. No pun intended. Iowans took to the mines for reliable work, harvesting what seemed to be an inexhaustible supply of a commodity suddenly in great demand. While less than 1% of the 2.2 million residents in Iowa in 1900 worked in the mines, that distribution was very uneven. In Monroe County, for example, home to 17,985 residents, 10% of the population actively worked in the coal mines, with many more than that participating in mining-related activities, including the railroad. By 1915, entire towns in the state of Iowa would rely solely on coal mines. Places like Fraser in Boone County, and places like Moran in Dallas County. These places had coal miners, and they filled the dance halls, and they filled the billiard parlors, and a diverse array of churches and church denominations. Immigrants also came in large numbers following the Civil War, spurred on by cheap land, and groups like the Iowa State Board of Immigration. Established in 1870, this group worked with Governor Samuel Merrill to publish materials like Iowa, the home of the immigrants, printed in English, German, Swedish, Danish, and of course, Dutch. The state facilitated settlement of immigrant groups, allowing them to form ethnic communities and preserve their cultural traditions, which helped them adjust to their new life in Iowa. Many of these ethnic groups gravitated towards places with unskilled laborers, like railroads and coal mining towns. Seemingly overnight, new places sprung up all across the state, like Highton, a Welsh community in Monroe County, Kearney, a Polk County Italian community. And even African Americans got in on the action. Some had been born slaves, others had been born free, but all came looking to improve their station in life. And they found work first as scabs in the mines, helping break the strikes, and later as reliable laborers in places like Enterprise, and places with peculiar names like Mushikanok or Mushikennik, depending on who you ask. And What Cheer, and Happy Hollow, and Carbonado. In a few places, like Buxton and in Ore Labor, those African American miners even became equals. And Colfax? Well, Colfax had it all. Immigrants and families who had been in the United States longer than the United States had even existed. There were blacks, there were whites, rich coal magnates, and miners who slept on dirt floors. In the 50 years between 1875 and 1925, Colfax's population more than quadrupled in size, mainly thanks to the tapestry of coal miners who lived in the community. Many more lived just outside of town in unincorporated communities. Between 1890 and 1900, the population of Colfax more than doubled in that 10-year time period, outpacing by percentage Des Moines, Sioux City, Waterloo, and many smaller to mid-sized communities as well, like Pella, Oskaloosa, Ottumwa, Ames, and even Newton. With 2,500 residents in the 1910 census, Colfax towered over communities that would later become giants. In 1910, Colfax had more people than Ankeny, Bondurant, Mitchellville, Altoona, and Urbandale combined. With the expansion of railroads, companies like the Chicago Great Western, the Chicago and Northern Railroad, and the Chicago Rock Island and Pacific invested in coal mines to secure a reliable and cost-effective fuel source for their steam locomotives. By owning and controlling the coal mines, railroads could ensure a steady supply of coal. It was essential for powering the trains and reducing the transportation costs associated with purchasing coals from external places, at a time when railroads were spending a lot of money expanding into new areas. Iowa bituminous coal was high in sulfur. It was known for its high heating value. It was used in energy generation and steel making as well. It was a middle-rank coal, falling between subterraneous and anthracite in terms of carbon content and hardness. It was often characterized by its black, shiny appearance and layered structure. Now, coal differs in its carbon content. The carbon and the coal that was mined here at Colfax was right in the middle. It didn't have exactly the highest carbon content. It fell somewhere in the vicinity of 45 to 85% carbon. And so what that did was it produced a coal that smoked somewhat, but it wasn't a real stinky or real smelly coal. But it wasn't the cleanest that was available on the market. It produced less soot and less smoke, especially if the mining companies were able to get it refined. Now, I was one of many miners who came to Colfax. My name is Charles John Freeman, and I was born in 1877 in Mahaska County. My father had been a farmer, and his father a farmer before that. My mother was of German ancestry, and I didn't know much of her family, except that I didn't know much about my past to begin with at all. We didn't talk about things like that at the time. You grew up, and you lived, and you tried to make a living to provide for your family. And growing up in Mahaska County in the 1880s, I was very familiar with the railroads. Railroads were all around me. And I knew the railroad was reliable, and anything related to trains was going to be good, solid work. I attended school in Mahaska County, but I wasn't particularly academic. And I planned to go into the mines in the community of Beacon when I was old enough. But just as I was ready to go on the job, something happened, something I would be very familiar with over the years. The coal miners at Beacon went on strike. Now, I worked in many mines around southern Iowa, moving with the mine's plan, and sometimes we'd move because a new operator might pay better, or because there might be better access to goods and services. It was really rare of us, however, to move because of improved mining conditions, at least before 1900. There was no safe mine, or at least what you would call, in your day, safe. There were some that were better than others, of course, but most of them had a wide variety of perils and dangers that we would potentially be exposed to. Now, I started work at a community called Troy down in Davis County. And from there, I moved on to Monroe County and worked at a place called Hocking. After living in Marion County at Harvey for a while, I ended up moving to Colfax around 1913. And I worked here before moving back to Lavilia in Monroe County, and eventually the small mining community paid off before retiring to Des Moines. Now, people think of Colfax today by the mineral springs. People think of the heyday that was here, the baths, the hotels. The fancy folks here came to drink the water. And let me tell you, the water is much better now than it was in my time. But for us, Colfax was, pun intended, cold. It was the thud of the pick on the stone, It was the clang of the buggy wheels going into the mines and coming back out. And you never forget the feel of that cold, black morning air, or the sound that your own breath makes when you're breathing on the mines. Now, coal was discovered in Jasper County by two young men, and it was purely accidental, all the way back in 1846. Or was it 1847? Well, the stories vary a little bit because there's two different accounts of coal being found. One locates it on the property of Hugh Patterson. The more known story locates it on the home property of Joseph Slaughter. And it was the Slaughter mine, perhaps, that was the more famous of them. Either way, it isn't really that important which one it came from because coal mining really wasn't that important at the time. In 1846, Iowa was getting ready to become a state. In late 1846, Iowa would become the 29th state. But people didn't use coal to heat yet. There was plenty of wood. Wood was all over the place, and it was way easier to get wood than it was coal. The primary users of coal were the steamboats at the time, and those were all the way down to the Des Moines River. There were no steamboats on the Skunk River. And although people knew that there was coal, there wasn't a whole lot of it at the surface. There were some exposed seams here and there, but even the Slaughter coal bank was only about 4 feet deep, and it wasn't a very good coal quality anyway. It was something maybe a blacksmith might use, if they absolutely had to. The settlers had no efficient way of getting the coal out either. The tools they had were primitive, but they were geared for clearing the land. In those early days, you also couldn't efficiently ship the coal. The railroad wasn't here yet. And that's when things really began to change here in Jasper County. Now, once the railroad arrived, the demand for coal increased, and it increased rapidly. And it didn't take long for a number of mining enterprises to begin. The Department of Natural Resources in your time has attempted to identify the location, the type, the names, and the years of the active mines. That's not an easy task. There were an awful lot of mines in Jasper County, and there were a lot of mines around Colfax. And the record keeping wasn't always consistent. And over the years, some of those records have even been lost. But most of the mining took place a distance outside of Colfax. There were railroad spurs that connected the mines to the main line, and those spurs would not only transport us to the mine site, but they would also be used for bringing the coal back. And we would use those to get the coal to the weigh stations so that they could see how many tons we brought up. And you always hoped that the person running the scales was being benevolent that day, because you were paid on the amount of coal that you brought up. While coal mining was slow during the Civil War, the Iowa geologist at the time even derided it because he felt not enough was being done to produce coal in the state. By 1870, that would all change. In 1871, a short distance to the east of town, the Watson No. 1 coal mine opened. And it was the first shipping mine in Jasper County. The company was formed in 1871, and they elected a president and a superintendent. The mine developed, and a switch was built connecting the railroad to the main line, and that allowed again for the product to be shipped to a much larger audience. The mine had a good run, and the company did prosperous business for a number of years, and then it eventually sold out to another mining outfit, Godfrey & Company. Now, the Watson No. 1 mine was what's called a shaft mine. And if you think about what a coal mine looks like, if you get a picture in your mind of what a coal mine looks like, you're probably getting one of about 4 different types of mine pictured. A shaft mine is one that goes deep into the earth. It's a vertical shaft straight down. And then there are horizontal tunnels called drifts or galleries that go off of the main shaft down. And that allows you to reach the coal beds. Now, the coal seams in Iowa, especially down in the southern part of the state, are quite deep in areas, and so surface mining really wasn't practical. The shaft mining also allowed people to get to a better quality of coal. And so coal-beneath towns like Colfax, as well as Buxton and Munchkinnon, this was a place where you were able to use these shafts to get better product. We were lowered down in cages sometimes, platforms or elevators as things progressed, and we brought the equipment into the shaft. There were ventilation systems, and that was critical to remove gas because the last thing you wanted to mine is a gas buildup. Coal was involved in the surface using hoists or conveyor systems. Now, because the records were still very primitive in 1871, we don't really know just how expensive the Watson No. 1 mine really was. You can see it here. This is on the 1875 Andreas Atlas map, and it's indicated on there in Mount Prairie Township. The site of Watson Station was located a short distance north, and that's where the railroad split off from. Now, if you look at this map here, you'll notice that there is a second coal deposit also mentioned out mine shaft would be put for the Ghetto Bailey mine. And this was a much smaller operation. And in 1875, the location wasn't actively being mined yet. But people knew there were coal there, and they knew that because it was much closer to the surface. So in 1876, mining began there, and they didn't need a deep shaft mine at this location. They were able to use a different sort of strategy to get their coal, and one that was, at the time, far more cost-effective. I should also point out this is much closer to the slaughter land where the coal was originally found in 1847. So the type of mine that they were able to do here was what they call a drift mine. And a drift mine is accessed by a horizontal tunnel called an avenue. And that's directly into the side of a hill. So this is a little bit of a hilly area, and so the coal was exposed on the side of the hill, and so they were able to tunnel in kind of at an angle to it. You didn't have to have the equipment to dig down deep, and so it was advantageous because you didn't have to put a lot of extra effort into bringing people to haul material away. You pay for that extra work and bring it back up. It's also less expensive to construct than a shaft or a slope line. There's no need for hoisting equipment. You can simply push the carts back out, or you can use a mule or a horse to pull the carts out. In the 19th century, southern Iowa coal regions, drift mines were often carved in the sides of riverbanks and ravines and hillsides. And if you go in some places down in Mahaska and Monroe County, you can still see in your time where these places existed. Some of these were family-run operations. Many of them were family-run operations, and they relied on very basic tools. Pick, shovel, maybe an axe. You didn't have the need for the real heavy equipment yet. So these are the four mines you typically see in Iowa when we talk about it. So there is the strip mine, which is all done on the surface, and we have some of that going on here. You have the slope mine, you have the shaft mine, and you have the drift mine. There's actually a fifth one we'll talk about here in a little while. But let's zero in on Colfax specifically. In 1875, while looking for coal, a mineral-rich spring was discovered while drilling just out to the east of town. Now, that discovery would transform Colfax into a popular health destination, and over the next 40 years, thousands and thousands would come to the community to experience the healing powers, or perceived healing powers, of the 14 mineral springs. At its peak, the community of Colfax had 9 different hotels offering mineral baths and spa treatments to the vacationing and visiting guests. The mineral springs marked a period of great prosperity and also national attention here in Colfax. And it allowed for a second major industry to develop. You had the coal mines and you had the mineral springs. And they attracted 2 very different types of people. Grace Tripp. The discovery of the fact that Colfax was underlaid with an artesian-born mineral water was accidental, and at the time a disappointing incident. What the drillers were seeking was coal. Instead, they got water. One can imagine how disgruntled they felt when, having drilled down slightly over 300 feet, water began to spout from their drill bits, and they realized that they would have to abandon the idea of mining coal at that point. Well, it didn't take them very long to discover that the mineral water was almost as valuable as the coal. Some might even say more so. We'll leave that up to you to decide. Either way, it changed the whole trajectory of the community. Now, as Colfax was growing, and as Colfax was attracting people to the spas, there was need for another type of community in the area. And so, just a short distance, about 3.5 miles to the northwest of Colfax, the town of Oswald was formed. And Oswald was a mining town, and it was developed along the Skunk River, started by a gentleman named Samuel Mole. And Mole quickly realized that the coal located on his property would be very profitable for him. He was a farmer, and he had good luck as a farmer. But the idea of the railroad coming through and him being able to sell the coal really got his attention. And so he went out and hired some gentlemen to come work on his property. And by 1880, it was reported that he had about a dozen miners working on his land. Well, 2 years later, in 1882, the Iowa Northern Railroad laid tracks through the area, and this opened up a lot more opportunity. The Iowa Northern connected with Colfax in the Oswald area, with Valeria and Reason. And while connecting to these other railroad towns, they were able to expand their customer reach. Now, the communities both had multiple railroads they could sell to instead of just one railroad line. They had a lot more potential for making profit. Now, Oswald in your day doesn't really look like a whole lot. But it was a pretty booming town, at least for a few years. It was formally platted and laid out in 1889, and it was named for Barnett Oswald, for my familiarity on that. He was a popular landowner and well-liked for the most part, and He was one of the towns, or he was from the township's oldest, or one of the oldest, and most proud families. Now, in 1885, it was reported that there were already, before the town was even platted, 3 boarding houses, 5 blacksmiths, a gunsmith, a general store, and a pool hall. The town went from a handful of miners in 1881 to more than 150 miners in 1883, and they were working in over a dozen different mining locations. Many of them also were immigrants, first-generation Americans, just learning what exactly it meant to be an American. By the early 1890s, there were more than 200 miners living in the community, and the residents numbered more than 1,000 when you counted the ones that lived in the countryside nearby. There were many businesses in town, and they did good business. People came to rely on them for services. There was a school called Plummer Grove, and there were 2 fraternal organizations if the miners managed to have a little bit of recreational time, which we didn't have a lot of that. Oswald's time, though, was infamously short. It was, first of all, the site of a number of unfortunate mining accidents. And as we talk about coal mines, you'll see that there were a lot of mining accidents over the years. But perhaps the most notorious one that happened at Oswald was the death of David Willey in 1892. Willey had gone and talked to the mine owner about loose slate and the concerns that he had about loose slate in the mine. His concerns were dismissed, and a short time later he was crushed by falling slate. Well, as you can imagine, that made the miners very angry because they knew that it was dangerous. They had complained that it was dangerous, and the mine owner, a gentleman named Mr. Kinzel, had not done anything at all. And they showed up at the livery stable of Mr. Kinzel, ready for a fight. And they showed up there with their picks and axes. And more miners showed up. And before too long, there was a huge show of it, and they had to call in the constable to take care of things. Now, I was not there to witness this, but the story was one of the many tales that the miners told one another down in the depths. Because when you're doing the same job day after day down in the dark, it gets a little dull after a while. It's very repetitive work. And so the miners, including myself, we became familiar with a wide variety of tall tales and stories and legends just for no other reason than to occupy our time. And maybe scare a few of the new miners that were coming in. For example, we talk about the Tommyknockers. The Tommyknockers were the ghosts of those who were killed in the mines, like Mr. Willey. And at a place like Oswald, we would use these stories to connect with each other. And we would use these to build a foundation, because although the immigrants, for example, didn't know our history here in central Iowa, everybody knows a good ghost story, right? Now, the Tommyknocker story is particularly interesting because that originated with Cornish miners. And it originated out in Pennsylvania originally, and they brought those tales here. And we mixed those with our tales that we have here. And so this whole different culture emerged from it. And there were a number of Cornish miners from the area of Cornwall and Great Britain who settled in Oswald. Now, unfortunately for Oswald, as more of the mines opened in the area, the amount of coal began to run out. Oswald also suffered a number of other indignities, a massive fire, and a tornado in 1896 that not only took out most of it, but a good chunk of Valeria as well. And when work began to decrease, around 1896, the miners began to look elsewhere. And you can see, even as early as 1885, there were a number of mines already operating here in the county, and a good number of them were around Colfax. Many of them were located north of Colfax, but as you can imagine, it began to become a problem when some of those the mines with lesser quantity began to play out. And so as those mines emptied, those people had to go somewhere else. Now, there was a gentleman that was involved with it, whose name was Mr. Couch. And Mr. Couch had purchased some land between Colfax and Oswald. And he was involved with the Jasper County Coal and Railroad Company. He opened several mines near Colfax, and later a few of them down closer to Monroe as well. And he did a lot of prospecting. And he went out and looked at all the land that was available to see what he could mine. And he ended up coming up with a number of different shafts that were open. Eventually, his company merged with another one of the local companies. The Colfax Coal and Mining Company and the Jasper County Coal and Railroad Company became the Colfax Consolidated Coal Company in 1902. And together, these two firms, as the Colfax Consolidated Coal Company, did a significant amount of business, not only in Colfax, but in Jasper County itself. And when they consolidated, it was big news around the state, because people knew that there was a lot of opportunity for coal here. Places as far away as Marshalltown and Des Moines reported that the Consolidated Coal Company had been formed, and that two businesses together were going to be highly profitable. And so it gave people an opportunity to think about what sort of opportunities would be afforded to them working for these companies. Now, almost as soon as they merged, they began opening new mine shafts. And with that, new communities were needed. So Oswald was on its way out by 1900, and certainly by 1902. But there was another community that was up and coming. And that was the town of Seavers. Now, Seavers is more of what you would think of as a company town. And we're going to talk more about it here in a little bit. But before we get into Seavers, let's talk a little bit about what life was like for those of us in the mines. What did it mean to be a coal miner? Well, I can tell you right now, it meant lots of early mornings. We were up long before the sun rose, and many times we weren't home till well after dark, which meant sometimes after working in the mine all day, we didn't see the sun before or afterwards, either one. My wife would have coffee ready in the morning. We drank a lot of coffee. Lunches, they were pretty meager. Bread, perhaps wrapped in a cloth in the dinner pail. Maybe on a good day, a boiled egg as well. Now, we lived near the south end of Colfax, and as you got out of town, you could hear the hum of the boiler. Some mornings, if the wind was just right, you could hear it from our porch. Sort of like the mine calling you back. 1915, Colfax had about half a dozen shafts working in the vicinity. Many of them, again, were run by the Colfax Consolidated Company, but there were other small companies as well. I worked at number 7, shaft number 7 first, then I later worked at number 8. At number 7, we drilled our own shot holes. What that meant is we would use a hand auger and we would drill into the side of the earth. Then we would fill the holes with black powder. Doesn't probably sound like a good idea in your time. Well, what we'd do next is we'd tamp it and then we'd light the fuse. And what that would do is it would blow the side of the wall up. And that allowed us to get to the gold. Shovel after shovel and the little rail cars that we called buggies, we would load it up. We'd haul maybe 5 or 6 tons a day if the shop fell right. And as we were paid by the ton, we hoped to be on the upper end of that. Dinner was often cold and quick, and usually was done before anybody even noticed. We'd sit on our shovels, our faces black with dust, and by the time we got home, we could fill a wash tub with just the coal dust that was on ourselves. It might sound funny, but bathing was nothing humorous for us. The first task of the miner upon arriving home was, of course, to bathe. Now, the Welsh homemakers, and there were a lot of Welsh miners in the Colfax area, they were particularly clean. And so, oftentimes, the Welsh wives would have the baths waiting for the husbands to come home. And so that would allow them to get a chance to be fresh and clean. Otherwise, the only opportunity to get clean was maybe before going to church or a important social engagement. The mine at number 7 was what was called room and pillar. And as I alluded to a few minutes ago, there's a 5th type of mine. That would be this one. The room and pillar mine is an underground unit with rooms cut out of coal. And we would leave large pillars in these rooms to support the ceiling. So the coal would essentially support itself. Now, this was safer and more stable than some of the earlier versions, especially in the shallower seams. And it became very, very common in central and southern Iowa. It allowed us to get to the coal easier and reduce the risk of collapse. Now, it also helped something called surface subsidence, and it prevented that. Because the last thing you want to do is be working in the mine and have something cave in on top of you. And that was particularly alarming in mine number 7 because the train tracks ran right above our head. And so you could sometimes hear the train going overhead while you were working in the mines. Now, I would light an oil wick can lamp, and I would tie it to my cap. It's a canvas cap, and I'd head down with a pack and an auger. My buddies and I would share a room down there hacking it at most time about a 6-foot seam, and we'd brace with timbers as we went. The grid-like patterns became sort of like a honeycomb. It looked kind of like a beehive down there. And it allowed for efficient ventilation as well, so it prevented the trapping of gas, which meant you had to drill fewer holes up to the surface. And after the mine was complete, you could collapse it in what was called retreat mining. Now, when it came to keeping things lit down in the mines, that was a whole different challenge, because if you think about it, you don't really have a whole lot of resources down there. You don't have matches you're carrying with you unless you're firing your shot. You want to make sure that you have a safe way to light things. And These lanterns like this, while they were useful on the farm, they weren't particularly useful down in the coal mines. And the reason for that is, if you hang this up on the wall, one, there's a good chance at some point during the day it's going to go out. And two, it's going to cast a lot of harsh shadows. And when you're working in the dark, harsh shadows don't make things any easier. And so we would rely on carbide lamps to help us see in the dark. Now these weren't a particularly ingenious device. Before this, they had oil wick lamps, and those produced a lot of smoke. They produced a lot of soot, and as you can imagine, in a mine where there might be a lot of methane gas buildup, you don't really want to have an oil lamp strapped to your forehead. Well, this still had an open flame on it, but it was a little bit less dangerous. And what you would do is you would fill water inside of it, and you had a carbide solution down the bottom, and it would create a gas. The gas would flow and rise through the piping system, and then it would come out as acetylene. And that's what we would light, and that's how we would see in the dark. And there would be a dish reflector that we would have on the front of it there. And that allowed us to see much clearer than using a lantern for light. Now again, even with this here, if there was a gas buildup, you didn't necessarily want to be using these. Fortunately, here in central Iowa, the number of gas explosions was fairly small, although they did happen. Black damp, also called choke damp, was the non-explosive mixture of gas, and it was almost as dangerous as an explosive mixture of gas. Because if you think about air and oxygen being displaced by carbon dioxide and nitrogen, it doesn't take very long for you to suffocate down in the mine and not even know. There was also the combustion of fire danger, and that was the type of fire that we were concerned about, mostly because those were the explosive kinds, and that was something that was always a present threat. Fire damp was a flammable gas, primarily methane, and it wasn't uncommon for that to accumulate coal seams if they weren't vented properly. And anytime you have that mixing with air, well, you got yourself a volatile situation. Windy shot was another potential risk that we had. When you placed a black powder charge or explosive, and it failed to dislodge the coal effectively, sometimes that would blow outward instead of inward, and that would release a very large flame into the mine, which is not something you want to have in your coal mine. And incidences like this with windy shot led to a number of incidents that caused people to be injured or even killed, and even eventually led to Iowa state mining laws and legislation being passed. As a matter of fact, some of the very first workplace safety laws in the state of Iowa came about because of windy shot incidences. Now here at Colfax, we didn't have a whole lot of problems like this. However, just south of here in Mahaska County, in 1892, 3 miners were killed at PK, which was a coal mine, specifically because of windy shot. 10 years later, at another coal mine down in Mahaska County, Lost Creek, 20 were killed when a windy shot explosion was so strong that it managed to twist the train tracks. Now here at Colfax Consolidated number 7, we had one major fire. And fortunately it happened when there weren't a whole lot of people in the mine, and that was in 1906. Nobody actually died people-wise in there, but we lost 19 mules. And that was a big deal because it was primarily a pony mine. We relied on the horses to help us get the coal out. And that was a pretty big investment to lose that many mules. Now there was actual machinery that was damaged in that as well, found about $115,000 in your money today. There were always present dangers. We talked about the roofs collapsing, but the railroad itself could be just as risky. For example, Richard Jones was one of the young men that worked in the mines. He was only 16 years old. And he fell and was passed over and ran over by a company coal car. Things like this happened all the time. And it wasn't uncommon for you to know at least one miner or two that was missing part of an arm, part of a leg, and maybe even all of one or the other. Now sometimes we would get our band up and we would protest that. And there was an incident in 1906, shortly before I arrived in the community, where they were sending coal miners out to the mines on some really rickety carts. And there was concern not only because the carts were falling apart, but also because they had no way, they didn't have any sort of real restraint system in there. So people were in a position where they could be really hurt falling off or getting struck by the train cars. And so they actually protested that. And there was a threat of going out on strike just over the safety of the coal cars. Because by 1906, people were starting to become conscientious of workplace safety. Now, the number 7 mine where I worked was one of the largest in Jasper County. It had 524 acres, and it had the Seavers mining community attached to it. Now, Seavers was a little bit different than Oswald, because the mines were very expansive there. You remember the Oswald mines were relatively small, and there were many of the different mines there owned by different people. But Seavers was a community that was attached specifically to number 7, later number 8. And it still had residents after World War I and even through the Great Depression. In your time, Seavers looks a little different. Supposedly, there's still one person that lives there. When I worked at mine, Seavers had a population of about 400 residents. It peaked around 1908. And the population estimates vary because it wasn't an incorporated community, which meant there was no census being taken there. So we don't really know how many people actually lived in town. We know a rough estimate of the number of miners, but you have to remember it was a company town. So you had miners, you had their families, their children, their spouses, sometimes elderly parents. And so the estimates put it anywhere between 500 and 800 residents. There were about 200 people that also worked at the mine that came from the town of Colfax itself. So every day about 200 residents from Colfax would go south of town and work just off of Seavers in Colfax Consolidated number 7. Now there was a company store there, the Colfax Mercantile Company, and it was run by a man named Hugh Gunn. And Hugh was very well liked among everybody. He was a very friendly, affable person. And in addition to that, and he was also the postmaster, I should specify that at the time, but there were other businesses as well. There was a billiard hall and a drugstore, and there was a grocery store. And unlike some mining communities, like Buxton, Seavers was not dry. They had a saloon there as well, which made it very popular. From 1901 to 1917 was when the post office was located in Mercantile. There was also a miner union hall, an International Order of Lockfellow Lodge, and a school. Now, many of the miners that lived at Seavers were also immigrants. And a lot of them had been displaced from a small community named Andersonville, which was located just a short distance to the east, southeast. The town of Seavers, the company town, it's a little bit hard to see in this picture, but if you look closely here, these are all the little 4-square mining houses that were there in the community. And they were very simple structures, but they provided shelter for the miners and their families. The town was named for W.A. Seavers. He was a gentleman from Oskaloosa, and he was a heavy engineer. And his whole family was involved in bridge making and railroads and coal mining. They were a very influential family in Oskaloosa. And his brother had been one of my supervisors at Hocking for a while down in Monroe County. Now they got involved with the Colfax Consolidated Coal Company around 1905 and became very prominent in that. And so they helped really to establish the town of Seavers kind of in the same vein as the more populated mining camps in Mahaska and Monroe County. It had a good start with number 7, which was opened in 1905, and the number 8 was opened after that, of course. And number 8 was a modern mine, at least in the sense of that particular time. It had electric lights. Colfax Consolidated number 8 had electric lights, and it was also the first mine to have automated machinery. And because the workdays were better regulated, and there were some technical amenities there, miners at Seavers were able to take advantage of some of the recreational activities that miners could have only dreamed about decades before. So in addition to having lodges and saloons and organizations where you could go and enjoy yourself, Seavers also had a baseball team. And it was a pretty good baseball team at that, even if it was made up of only miners. And they also had a square dancing club that met there, and they would travel all around central Iowa and would compete. Now the picture you're seeing here, this is from the Iowa Gazetteer and Business Directory, and this is from 1905. And if you in your time are interested at all in genealogy, this is a wonderful resource to take advantage of. Because the Iowa Gazetteer was like a phone book before they had phone books. You don't have phone numbers listed in there, although some people did have telephones at the time. But it more or less lists all the businesses that were in town at any given point during its printing. Now, Seavers made news periodically as well. And it made news in places far away from Jasper County, or at least far away at the time. So, for example, they're in Mahaska County. And in this particular instance, there was a lawsuit that was going on in Seavers because a gentleman had gotten paralyzed in the mine. And he was suing his former employer, the coal company, for his loss and his inability to work. The courts sided with the mining company and not the miner. But it was a very interesting piece, and it was something that really got people's attention around the state, particularly in southern Iowa where there were other mining communities, because it would have set a judicial precedent. Now, it's also worth noting in here that the other thing, aside from the lawsuit being reported in Oskaloosa, was the fact that Mr. Gunn, the manager of the Mercantile Company, was moving to Colfax proper, where he would become a businessman here in town as well. By 1919, things were beginning to change here in Colfax itself, and with that, things were starting to change in Seavers as well. Mining was declining, and by 1919, there really weren't a whole lot of people living in Seabirds. The population by 1917 was at 500, so down from the 800 or so that it was at its peak. And as soon as the mines began to play out, people quickly moved elsewhere. Some of the houses were moved, many of them were torn down, and over time, the community returned back to the land. Now, the railroad line that went into Seabirds was actually the same line that went the other direction into Oswald. And in 1916, they abandoned the section that went into Oswald. There was no regular rail service either direction after 1918, but there were still intermittent railroad trips into Seabirds after that. The last building to remain was the company store. By 1925, the shafts were completely empty, and in 1926, the train tracks were pulled out. That marked the end officially of the community of Seabirds. And it also marked the end of an important period in Colfax and Jasper County history, because Colfax was changing too. As much of the country moved into the Roaring 20s, Colfax's most interesting and successful period was actually starting to decline a little bit. People were able to go farther, and so people were able to take advantage of other spas and other places out further west. Things like places like Colorado Springs. So just who exactly were the people that were here at Colfax during this peak? Well, there were a wide variety of people involved in the mines. There were, of course, the pig miners like me. We were the primary coal diggers. And we'd use our axes to extract coal. There were loaders that put coal in the carts. And there were trappers, often young boys and girls, sometimes as young as 8, that would work in the mine. They were too young for the heavier work, but they would be used to operate trapdoors or pick up smaller pieces of coal that might have fallen off during the loading. Later on in the century, there were machine cutters. They became more prominent as technology evolved. And some miners became skilled laborers operating heavy machinery as it became available. There are, of course, managers and foremen. You always have to have somebody supervising you, right? And sometimes they would even go as far to make sure things were safe. Sometimes. Horse and mule drivers, of course, they were in charge of running the carts, the horse carts that pulled coal out. Timbermen, they maintained the integrity of the building by making sure the supports were intact. Blacksmiths kept their tools sharp. And the service workers were perhaps the most numerous. And those were all the people, everybody from the railroad brakeman to the coal dealer that would go to Des Moines, that all helped that supply chain. It took a lot of people to work a coal mine. Like any big job, there were people that had all kinds of skills and talents. You didn't necessarily know that by looking at us. And sometimes talents came about in unexpected ways. Now, I talked earlier about the Welsh, and there were a lot of Welsh here in Colfax. The miners here in this town were primarily from England, Wales. They also came from Central and Eastern Europe as well. We don't have an exact breakdown because often the miners were transient, and sometimes they wouldn't stay for very long, so it made it hard to get a count. And people would work for short periods of time and then move on to other mines. But Grace Tripp records that Colfax was an excellent example of such a melting pot. A rather large percent of the population consisted of men from Wales and their families, miners who worked in our soft coal mines. As I see it now, they were sterling material in our melting pot. They were on the whole industrious, honest, thrifty, scrupulously clean, intelligent, and in general of fine moral fabric. They were not overly clannish, but entered into the life of the community wholeheartedly. Besides making a general wholesome contribution to the life of the town, the Welsh people shared one thing with us that greatly enriched the life of the whole community. They brought with them from Wales their native interest and ability in singing. Every Welsh home was a singing school, and every Welshman a singer. As one listened to these men, it was most difficult to realize that they had come up from the depths of the coal mine after a hard day's work, scrubbed themselves, and were now giving expressions of the spiritual form from within. Now, in Colfax, during the early part of the 20th century, the coal miners would actually lead what we would call, or what you would call in your time, a community choir. And this represented all generations through town. It brought people together, young and old, of different backgrounds, of different skill levels. And they would sing together. And they would rehearse together once a week throughout the winter. And they would be led by various coal miners who just happened to not be working that night. And Grace records that under their direction, every detail mattered: the pronunciation, the dynamics, the tempo, and they also maintained that every musical piece must be memorized. And when performance day came, they would go to places like Des Moines, Oskaloosa, or on one occasion even Omaha, Nebraska. And they would compete, go toe-to-toe with league clubs from colleges and prep schools. As one critic once remarked about Colfax Welsh singers, they're funny looking, but they sure can't sing. It's nice to talk about the scene because sometimes mining communities get a reputation for being rough. You think about the types of people that live there and their backgrounds, and it's understandable why some of these places became rough. And of course, Colfax wasn't without crime. Now, it's particularly interesting, though, because in 1904, there was a scandal here in town. And that's because unwelcome news had reached the community of Newton and eventually reached the community of Des Moines. And that was the case that it was alleged that the postmaster of Colfax, who was involved in the mines, John M. Topper, was short in his accounts for the company. It's reported that he's no longer holding his position, and experts are making a careful and secret examination of the books. Absolutely nothing is given out as to the real circumstances, but all sorts of rumors are afloat. His shortage is placed at all the way from, get this, $2,200 to $25,000. Now, we unfortunately never heard how this exactly resolved, because by the time I got here in 1913, this controversy was long settled. And it was settled because Mr. Topper had disappeared to what we found out later was Leavenworth, Kansas. Take that for what you will. Sometimes there was other agitation. In one particular instance, a reformer, a woman named Mother Jones, as they called her, showed up at Colfax. And she was what the mine managers called an agitator. We called her a reformist. But she came to the community and she encouraged us to work together to try to defend ourselves from any predatory practices of the mining companies. And in this particular instance, when she came to Colfax in 1902, she was lobbying politically. And she was lobbying for coal mining change. She was promoting safe work environments. She was promoting the responsibility of the mining corporations. And she was advocating organized labor. And the miners at Colfax bought into the organized labor philosophy, and there were a number of instances that caused the miners to go on strike. In one particular instance, it was safety. In another particular instance, it was about the mine companies refusing to pay the railroad fares. Because even though they were in with railroad companies, we still had to pay to go to work and ride the train. And the miners didn't like that too much. Grace Tripp also remembers that at certain seasons of the years, the miners scarcely saw the sun. They worked strenuously and would work dangerously underground for long hours and receive compensation that was totally inadequate and in concert with the hardships that we endured. So the miners struck. They asked for an 8-hour day and an increase in pay. The company official was adamant in their refusal to accede. They contended that they would not be able to make ends meet if an 8-hour day was instituted. They were most incensed that the miners were audacious enough to ask for such an impossible concession. The idea of an 8-hour day was something the mines did not want to do because they thought they wouldn't be able to remain in business. Well, days lengthened into weeks and weeks into months, and the company lost thousands of dollars. But we eventually got a pay raise. There were a number of other mining communities, or a number of other mining shafts and companies that existed, some of them quite small, some of them very large. The Klondike Mine only lasted a very short period of time, about 6 months in 1897. Others lasted a number of years. The McAllister Coal Company, we don't know exactly when people stopped working there. The Warwick Brothers was a slope mine in the northwest side of Colfax. The Sunnybrook Coal Company was a vertical shaft southwest of Colfax. The Hopkins Coal Company was the last one to operate with any large-scale mining, and it was a modern mine. And while the output was far less than that of Colfax at its peak, it still managed to produce coal into the 1950s. And when it finally closed in the early 1950s, it marked the end of the coal mining chapter here in Jasper County. Now, Iowa's coal production grew sometimes exponentially. It grew rapidly. And it peaked in 1917. And it's interesting to note that 1917, when it peaked, is also about the same time the number of automobiles jumped significantly in the state of Iowa. And there's a little bit of correlation with that. As people began traveling by car, there was less demand for the railroad. People were still heating homes with coal, but they were beginning to become other ways of heating homes as well. And so coal began to fall out of favor after World War I. It also became just as efficient and just as cost-effective to bring in coal from elsewhere. There were coal mines in West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, and it didn't cost any extra to ship that in. And that allowed the Iowa coal fields to return to farm fields. In 1893, Jasper County was in 12th place in terms of county coal production in the state of Iowa. Moved it to 11th place in 1894 and 9th place in 1897. The highest that it cracked in terms of county ranking was in 1900 when it was number 7 in coal production for the state. By 1908, it was beginning to drop, however. Although there were still active coal mines in the community, people were beginning to look at other resources. And some of those resources were beginning to empty out entirely. Jasper County still managed to remain in the top 20%, in the top 20 counties through 1917. The railroads reduced demand. There were fewer passengers, more driving. There was transition to diesel engines. There was a rise in competing energy sources, natural gas and fuel oil, and coal was beginning to run out in central Iowa. Despite that, some of the mining continued. And smaller mines perhaps remained active belongs. So as we bring this to a close here, I want to repeat what I said at the beginning. Think about this in terms of community and the real importance of community. Because when you think about we the coal miners and what we did, how we lived with each other, a few things come to mind that may be useful in your time. First of all, working together was essential. When we formed unions, when we formed organizations, we were strong. We were stronger as a unit than you are as individuals. We came from different backgrounds. We had different philosophies. We had different religions. We had different ethnicities. We had different political views. But we all worked together as best as we could. And we used what we had at our disposal. We had our own abilities, and the mining companies knew that we had those abilities. And although they could bring in workers to scout, and they could bring in workers from other places to work in our stead, we still had the power to influence change, and we did that. When we talk about local stories, they illuminate national and world struggles. Because what we experienced here in the coal mines of central Iowa was felt all around the country in the early part of the 20th century and the late part of the 19th century. The timber fields out on the west coast had many of the same situations as we had. The safety risks looked different, but at the end of the day, people wanted to have safe work environments. History gives voice to the forgotten. As we talk about the people who live in these communities, they come to life. Because if you just look at a name on a page or a statistic in a book, you don't really get the full story. We don't understand people like Grace Tripp, who recorded her experience living in the community. We also see that technology and labor shape each other. We work and we build technology to reduce our work. And we do that so we can have additional recreation. But oftentimes, the technology just makes more work just difficult for us. Progress comes at a cost, and that's part of it. History repeats itself, but only if we forget. History never really truly repeats itself, but there are definite patterns. And I would expect in your day there's probably still discussion about labor, payments, corporations and businesses, justice for workers, and things of that nature. There always has been. Topics go back clear to ancient times. But the biggest thing to take away from this is that community fortitude is timeless. When you're working together, when you're understanding each other, you're bridging your differences, you can make a very powerful change in the world. Now, my name is Dave Baker, and talking to you as myself instead of as Mr. Freeman, I write and photograph and research and do everything else under the sun for a page called The 29th State. The 29th State exists mainly on Facebook, only because I'm the world's crappiest web programmer. Otherwise, I have my own website. We're working on that. The 29th State was a product of when I worked at the Pella Historical Society back in 2009. And at that point in time, they had sent us from Dutch land over to Danish land, a place called Elkhorn. And they sent us there so that we down in Pella could learn how to run a museum like the Danes did. Because apparently the Dutch weren't doing it right. Don't tell them that. They sent us there. That's the big thing for me from it. And so what was interesting about the experience, though, wasn't so much what happened at the museum, but it was the fact that when I saw what was at Elkhorn, the wonderful museum they have there, the windmill that they have there, and the culture that exists there, the Danish culture that exists in Elkhorn, I wanted to tell people about it. And I wanted people to get excited about Iowa history. And at the time, I was in college, and I had a roommate who was from northwestern Iowa, and he kind of, or excuse me, northeastern Iowa, pardon me, and he kind of laughed at me a little bit. Well, it's not that much interesting around here. And so I did what any sensible human being would do at the time. I said, well, I'm going to write a book and put all the interesting places of Iowa in there. Well, it's now 2025. This project is old enough it can drive its own car at this point. And I'm pleased, very pleased to admit that as of earlier this year, we do have the first of what will be 3 books on the market. And so this is more than waypoints. And a little sales pitch, I do have copies of this if you are interested. We'll talk about that here in a minute. But more importantly than buying my book, which is not the real reason I do this, is this book contains histories of every incorporated town in the center 33 counties of Iowa. 315 communities. And it tells the story, as best as you can on one page, of the people and the places that made up these communities and made them interesting. And so there's things in here that are probably familiar with you. Of course, the mineral springs here in Colfax, the Dutch settlers in Pala. But there's things in here you probably didn't know, or you probably wouldn't know as well. And so even if you don't end up getting a copy, if you're able to pick up a copy from a friend or from a library, I would recommend sitting down with it. And as you read through it, think about people that you might know who are from those communities. Because you might start seeing some patterns. You might understand where they're coming from and some of their philosophies. I would also invite you, if you want something for free, come out and follow my page, 29 State on Facebook. I post new stuff every couple of days, sometimes every day if I'm feeling real adventurous and if I don't have 3 programs in a week lined up because I overbooked myself this week. It's been fun, it's been okay. But I put a lot of stuff out there, and there's a lot of great resources. One of the best things about having a Facebook page is reading the comments on it, because it's a lot of fun to watch people connect with each other. And those of you that have been, I see some familiar faces out there, so I know there's some people that have been to the programs that I do. I'm looking at you, John, over there. One of the things I tell people at programs, it's so much fun to read the comments and see people connect, because sometimes people don't even know each other. And they might comment on a page and say, that's Storm Lake, my grandparents lived there. And somebody else says, well, my grandparents lived there. And next thing you find out, their grandparents were next door neighbors. Or you find out that their grandparents, when they were children, played with each other. Or in the case of one example, I'm not going to go in here right now, somebody dated somebody else and they've now gotten back together. But it's a lot of fun seeing people reconnect with each other. So if you would like to come out and follow the page, I would recommend it. We have a lot of fun out there and share a lot of stories. One of the big things with this, when you're writing a book, when you're putting together a presentation, you aren't anything without good sources. And so I always want to make sure to give pause at the end for the wide variety of sources that I use with these programs. The communities of Iowa make my life easy. Many, many towns have put out wonderful centennial and now sesquicentennial books in some cases that document the histories of the town. Colfax put out one in 1966. We have anybody here from Mingo? Okay, back up Mingo. Mingo by Jango, cool. Mingo put out a centennial book, and I'm biased on that because, you know where Greencastle Cemetery is? Been to Greencastle? Who's been to Greencastle? Okay, oh good. A lot of people. Okay. When you go into Greencastle, you gotta remember, my name's Dave Baker, right? You go into Greencastle and you come up the drive, there's a great big huge tombstone that says David Baker on it. That's a lot of fun to see when you're 7 years old, let me tell you that. He's my great grandfather. And he's responsible for the town of Mingo, largely responsible for the town of Mingo, because when the railroad came through, it bypassed Greencastle. And it went through the area of Mingo. And the people at Colfax sneered at that. They thought it was silly because the area where Mingo was, it was all a bunch of swamp. Well, it was Baker land, and he went out there with a shovel and he dug that little ditch that goes to the town still and drained it all off. And, well, that long story, Greencastle no longer, well, it kind of exists. I won't say it doesn't exist, but it's not anything like it was in the 1800s. And of course, Mingo ended up being the railroad community. So I say that all lead into the fact that Mingo has a wonderful centennial book. If you haven't checked that out, it is, and again, I'm biased, but it's one of the best ones that I've come across. It's got some great stories in there. It's got a lot of fun facts. It's very well researched. It's well sourced. And I'll tell you right now, if you look at the recipe section, you will go, boy, do we have it good. I'm trying to remember how the recipe for a rabbit starts out. Something like catch a rabbit. Catch a rabbit, yeah. There's a recipe for head cheese in there. I'm not going to go into that right now. That's a whole other adventure. Anyway, so thank you very much for coming out. If you have contributed in any way to Jasper County or Iowa history sources, whether you're writing for historical societies, historical organizations, publications, newspapers, anything like that, thank you. I am eternally grateful for all of you. Real quick, couple of thank yous. Larry, thank you so much for getting this lined up. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here again. It's been a while since I did a program at Colfax, and it's sure a lot of fun to be back. Stu Patterson, a friend of mine from college back there, he's keeping Colfax Main Street alive, and we're very appreciative of that. So I know that you did some promotion, and they're in the back. I'm drawing a blank on your name at the moment. Yes, also did a ton of promotion, so thank you. Here in the center, my right-hand man, Gavin Behrman, running the camera, and I don't know what's wrong with him mentally, because he gets up at 4 o'clock in the morning sometimes and goes out with me to take pictures of ghost towns in the middle of nowhere. I don't know how many empty fields that we've gone through, and you look around and you go, there's nothing here. Yeah, that's what the general store was right there. You didn't really use your imagination on some of this stuff. A couple other quick thank yous. John Jasper over here, I joke with him. John is just a huge amount of information, just a fountain of knowledge, and railroad questions, full line questions, he knows his stuff, and so I always appreciate when he shows up and does this. And so I've got a number of family members here, which is a lot of fun, so thank you all for coming out too and enabling me to do this over the years, because back home I've got a wife and 2 kids, and they let me come out of the house once in a while and do this stuff. So Danielle, if you're watching, thank you. The live stream is back there. Hopefully they're home for vacation Bible school. All right, thank you very much, everybody.